Hey folks, it's Rob Flux here with another one of our Sunday sessions and a special one in the series of In the Beginning, where we go back to the first projects of very successful property people to understand everyone had to do deal number one. What was the mindset, the issue, the challenges that that person had to overcome before becoming the successful person that they are today? Today, we've got a very special guest and personal friend of mine, Roderick Dashevici. We go back 15 plus years from our IT world and have had a very parallel property development career. And so, mate, I would love to welcome you into the show. So welcome, everybody. Rod Dashevici. Hey, mate, how are you?
Yeah, well, how are you? Good morning.
Mate, 30 odd projects, 10 plus years in doing this space. It's over $70 million worth of projects that have been realized. So quite successful in what it is that you do right now. But we're going to take this all the way back to the beginning and go, where the hell did you come from? What were the issues and challenges that you had to come to start?
Yes.
And mate, knowing quite a bit of your journey and having known you for so long, there's quite a tale to tell.
Yeah, there's a bit there. I definitely wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth.
Well, that's probably a great place to start, just from a segue perspective, mate. If you go all the way back to childhood, one of the stories that you've shared with me is the fact that you actually had some challenges in, I guess, the family financial situations and that sort of thing. So kind of what was the background that you grew up in?
Yeah, so I'm in Brisbane now, as you know, as are you, and that's where I was born as well. I was born into, regular sort of family. My parents had worked very hard, and they'd had a multiple number of like fish and chip shops and restaurants and things like this. So hardworking, working class. They came from humble beginnings as well, and as my young life progressed, that side of their businesses and everything just it came to an end by the time I was about 5, I think. So they had a couple of significant restaurant failures by then, and around 5, it all wrapped up, and they actually, they went into bankruptcy, and our life changed really substantially. Family home went, restaurants went. My father no longer worked. He was pretty much out for the count, and that's how it's been since, actually, for him.
But that's not a good environment to grow up on, and that I'm sure would have left a whole bunch of, I guess, money challenges and money mindset challenges for you, and also potentially drivers to say, I'd never want to do that again. So, kind of, where did that fit for you, mate?
Yeah, so I mean that's it. So it was interesting in that I probably had the benefit of the first few years being quite good. Like I remember as a kid, I'd sit in the corner of the restaurant, and I'd have my little box of Lego. I'd play with Lego, and then a chef would bring me lunch, and it would be like prawn cutlets. So it's pretty funny. One of my highlight memories actually is that one time, because it was Easter, they rolled chocolate, like a chocolatier would. They rolled it into these fine strands, and they crafted a basket out of it. And they gave me this chocolate basket with a little handle on it, full of strawberries, and that was pretty fantastic. I haven't seen much like that since, but anyway, yeah, that was incredible. But anyway, so I had that side of things, which was nice. Like, I guess it was comfortable as a kid with the usual sort of things. Obviously, I'm unaware as a 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old. It's all just normal, right? And then bankruptcy comes, and there's heaps of money problems. There's financial issues all the time. There's arguments. I'm seeing my father not get back up, and yeah, just my mum had to pick up the load, really. And it was in very, very humble jobs from there, and we were bouncing around the place through rentals. And at one stage we lived in my grandmother's house, so she just vacated in order to give us her home, which was pretty amazing. That was up in Margate, just a basic little post-war home. And there was definitely, I mean, you mentioned that the formation of money habits and thoughts and beliefs and that sort of thing. It was very evident to me that We didn't have money for anything. Like my parents couldn't afford to repair the car most of the time if it needed assistance. There are all sorts of things we went without, and I know not everyone had a car. It's all relative, right? And we're still talking about growing up here in Australia, where if you're homeless, someone probably comes along and puts food in your mouth, which is obviously a nice thing. It's not like other places, so I do have some form of context there. But yeah, that was how it was going forward from there. Definitely grew up through my younger years and teen years going, I don't want to be in that scenario. Yeah, so there was a formed thought there. I don't want this for myself, and I want better.
Yeah, which is really interesting because I guess there's a fight or flight type of response. So some people curl up in the fetal position and go, "Woe is me," and I'll never do anything with it. But you use that instead to, I guess, fuel you and drive you to say, "I'm not going to be this person." Like that, there's some lessons in that for people out there to go. The thing that happens to you does not necessarily have to define the meaning that you give it.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's all plastic. I guess we all have trauma one way or another. It's going to be inevitable. So it's at the end of the day, I suppose it's what you take from that and how you do use that in order to move forward or not or whatever. I'm aware that we're all always controlled by our structures and beliefs as it is, but what I know now that it did take me a long time to realize is that you've got the opportunity to adjust those, and then you can change your course, right? You can change your course in life. You can choose to go down a new path. You can choose to use those traumas to your benefit or free yourself of them and do something that's going to be better for your life or whatever it is that you want to be doing.
Yeah. Right. So let's talk about, I guess, how you then started to transition into, I guess, a career of sorts. Job number one, I think, was Domino's Pizza from memory.
You're right. Yeah.
Were you pizza delivery dude? Who were you? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
Who was the character on the ads way back? Was it Johnny? I can't remember. Dougie.
Dougie. Yeah.
Were you Dougie delivering? Or were you back making pizzas? What was your role, mate?
I was the lesser known Dougie. Yeah, definitely. Yep. I had I delivered pizzas, and then when I wasn't delivering pizzas, I was out the back cleaning dishes in one of those fun commercial dishwashers where you put everything in, you pull the big hood down, and it washes it all in like 20 seconds flat. It's pretty amazing. And then out the front, I guess, taking customer orders and working with the team, all that sort of thing. One funny thing was that I remember all the delivery drivers had to keep their cars clean, external and internal. And I remember asking the boss one time, do I have to clean mine externally as well? Because every time I wash it, more paint comes off. It wasn't great. It was an old brown Corona was my first car, and it had big. I bought it for $1,200, and it had big rust holes in it and so on because it had originated in WA, and when I bought it, it had been driven over here by some French travellers that then sold it off before going back to France. Yeah, and it was a bomb.
So what was your first payday?
Payday. I mean, just before that role as well, I also did. I sort of led into that with I was working at the local takeaway shop, and I'd deliver fish and chips around the place, and again the same thing: take orders, clean stuff, all that kind of thing. And that was all I knew, right? Like my parents obviously came up through a hospitality background, being restaurant owners and that sort of thing. So it was something that I was somewhat aware of. And when you're that age, you just try to get a job wherever you can, right? Particularly when you don't have any family business to go into, you don't have anything privileged to go into in terms of like a job, a role, connections, anything like that.
Yeah. I remember my first ever job as an apprentice. I was earning $2 an hour, mate. $2 an hour. Like,
Yeah.
how does that get you anywhere? Like, your first paycheck, the first one that you actually got in your hand, how much was that? Do you remember?
I'll be guessing, but I think it would have been whopping. It would have been like a whopping 3 hours worth of work or something, with some tips for probably like $19 or something to that degree. It's probably six. I think it's $5 or $6 an hour I started on.
Yeah.
Something to that degree. Yeah.
Well, that's not going to get you far in life, is it, mate? That's not driving you. When you go back and have a look at the fuel and the fire, as to I don't want to go through the same process that mum and dad did. Like,
Yeah.
When you get paychecks as small as that, how does that drive you?
Well, it wasn't a lot of money then, and it would be a lot less now. So it wouldn't get you far. Like $20 back then would probably get you half a tank of fuel, whereas now it's like what, an eighth or something.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny. So, yeah, I guess having when I want to change my circumstance at large, I like to have a look at what the other possibilities could be, and I'll go and research these things and take a look and sort of sit in other opportunities. So I might go and research people in a certain area and then go see what it is they do and try to spend time in that and understand that. So again, from having some background there in the restaurant of what it could be and see, at times when it was going well, I still had that in my memory. So it didn't feel, I knew that this was my reality, that we were in this scenario, but I knew it could be different. But having said that, it's not like they're in a great spot. Obviously, they weren't in a great spot, and it didn't work out well. When things were good, they could just hold it together, and then clearly it didn't take too much for it to go the wrong way in a pretty serious direction. But yeah. I suppose being aware that the glass ceiling can shift and raise was a benefit to me. Yeah, but the finance, earning that kind of money, earning the few dollars here and there was, look, it was very nice, I suppose, in terms of I've got some independence, I've got my own money, all that kind of stuff that people like. Everyone wants autonomy, control over their scenario, and then you've got the ability to spend a little bit the way you please and have some free time, I guess. But
it's not going to get you where you want to go.
No, it wasn't. Obviously not going to work. And from there I did chase different roles and more roles that obviously involved more money, but at a period that I'm sure we'll get into later, I realized that had its limitations, but it took me a long time to figure that out.
Yeah, well, let's go through some of those iterations as we go, right? So you, I guess, started, an IT career, but you didn't go straight into IT. You kind of came through a back door to kind of get in there. I think you were working at EB Games from memory, mate. So
yeah,
what were you doing at EB, and what was the transition to get you, I guess, into that IT space?
Yes. So when I was at Domino's, I'd been there for a while, and the reason I joined Domino's was because I needed a job, and I'd applied over the end of year to all sorts of places, and I ended up saying to myself, if I don't have a role by whatever February or something to that degree, I'll just go drive pizzas at Domino's. And yeah, that's what happened.
That's what happened.
So that's how I ended up there. And someone mentioned to me that the local EB Games, because I was into computers and things like that too, the local EB Games was looking for Christmas casuals at a time. They had a little sign up on the window, and I went down there and went, oh, okay, yeah, cool, no worries. When are you looking to, when do you want to have resumes in and all this sort of stuff? So I found out the deadlines, and then put my resume together and put everything behind that, all of my thought and effort, and there was a lot of focus on that, I suppose. Like, I did go very strongly for that role. I wanted that role. I saw it as a way out of Domino's and a step up. So I interviewed, and I did get one of the two roles, which was great. Did lots of hours through Christmas there. Had now moved from like food hospitality to retail, which is they're closely associated, obviously, in many ways. And I don't really want to go back to retail now at all, but it was a step up at the time. So
Yeah.
I did that for quite some time. Ended up being an assistant manager there because I, again, was chasing promotion and betterment, and I wanted more financial reward for my efforts and all this kind of thing. So diligently put my work and effort in my personal time into the fair to, to seek out that goal. I ended up running a couple of stores in a couple of different locations close to each other there over the couple of years I was there.
Yeah, but your transition into IT from memory came because you actually met your boss as a client there. Is that right?
Yeah. These guys would come in, and all I knew was they had an IT shop of some description. Not a shop, but they had an IT company, and they were doing server and desktop support, like managed services for small businesses and this sort of thing. And they would buy. I don't know if it was a Christmas thing or something like this, but they would buy Xboxes, and I think they were maybe giving them to clients or a raffle or something or other. So anyway, these guys would come in a bit, and we would get chatting and so on and so forth. And they seemed like fun, friendly guys doing something that I was relatively well versed in, because I used to, obviously video games, computers. I used to put computers together and all that sort of stuff before computers were, of interest to the general public, and before it was just such a household thing to have laptops around the place. So my dad kind of got me into that, which was good. I had to ask these guys for a role something like 5 times, I think. So I don't really know why I specifically thought they would give me a role, but nonetheless, I asked multiple times, and after say the 4th or 5th time, they end up saying, well, we've got an opening for you now if you want to come by and have a chat. So I went and met with these people, and I did get the role, and that was doing desktop support, software support, server support, all this sort of stuff, just from my basic background knowledge of building machines, selling them, just stuff like that. So a bit of an interesting transition. No formal training, no university in that respect or anything like that. So
but it was
an odd scenario.
It was your boss there from memory that gave you the little spark into the property world from memory. That I think you mentioned that he had a number of houses and that sort of thing, and kind of got you curious about this property journey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he had I think he had 5 at the time, which was relatively unheard of for me. I don't think I knew of anyone who had five houses, and yeah, they were just meager little houses around the place. But he had basically, because we'd be talking around 2000 and early 2000s, like this sort of period here, I suppose. And that is obviously when the boom was happening, and people were making money hand over fist doing all sorts of stuff. So he had bought a few little houses here and there for, I don't know, I could guess 50, 80 grand, something like this, around the place in some of the outer suburbs. And he was renovating them and renting them out and things like this. And his equity had grown. He'd extended his own home. So he was doing these things, and he used to turn up. He had like a nice car and an older car, and he'd turn up to auctions in his older car, and he'd put on all of these like sort of ratty looking clothes and so on, and take his baby along and pretend that he was a poor schmuck, and go play auction games and things like this. So yeah, I got to see a bit of that, which was quite interesting. Pick their brains about why they were doing that, what their plan was, how they did it financially. Back then, you could just borrow, endless money from the bank, basically.
Well,
very easy.
Houses were 80K, mate. I remember buying my first house at 55K. If only we could still do that today. Like times have changed. Yeah, but I guess it's all relative. But that was back when I was on $2 an hour too. So,
yeah.
So anyway, that kind of started your curiosity about the property space, and largely in that buy and hold capacity from from memory, and you went down a path. I guess one of the early educators out there, a gentleman by the name of Steve McKnight, I think, from memory. Oh, we've lost Rod and his internet, and he's back. Had some small IT challenges there, folks.
Yeah, I think the NBN network's letting me down this morning. This is the second time.
That's all good, mate. We will do what we can to slice and dice that.
Just edit it.
I'm not quite sure at what point you dropped out, mate, but we were just talking.
You were just saying, you were mentioning a gentleman's name, if that helps. You were saying, I think you met a gentleman by something, and then I lost you.
All good. So I think we're talking about the buy and hold side of things, and you started your journey, I guess, investigating that with a gentleman by the name of Steve McKnight, who,
yes.
Yeah. So what was your intro to Steve? Was it reading his books? Was it turning up to his seminars? What was the intro there, mate?
Yeah, it was a really serendipitous sort of foray into that. So I, as part of my IT role there, at one stage, that small company got involved in educational software for people's homes, for kids. And I was going out and doing some of the installations in people's homes, setting it up on their computer and spending sort of 2-3 hours there and showing them how to use it, things like this. So I would be sent randomly around the place, depending on where someone bought something, obviously within geographic reason. So one time I went up into the Gold Coast hinterland, up into a big property, and it was this it was quite a cool old house from maybe the 60s or 70s, and it looked east towards the water, and it had probably octagonal glass, I think, and I remember there being a central atrium where there was a big tree and all sorts of things. So a very interesting house. And that was where the couple were, and their kid or kids. So I was there doing all the software and so on, having a chat. And given that you're there for a couple of hours at a time, you tend to just, while the the status bars are going across and you're installing stuff, there's time to chat. Just what do you do? What's blah blah, all this sort of stuff. So these guys, one was a TAFE teacher, and one was a retail manager. So both, normal sort of roles, normal sort of people, which was cool. And this house was worth, it was just, you could tell it was a very expensive house at the time. So I was just quite interested about how there seemed to be a little bit of a mismatch here. I was very interested in how are these guys here and so on. And I'm sure I was somewhat eloquent in how I asked, but effectively I found out that when they weren't teaching TAFE and doing retail management, they had been doing renovations, buying houses and flipping them and so on. And they gave me an interesting piece of advice, which is not for everyone, but could be good for certain personalities. And that was bite off more than you can chew and then chew like mad.
Yeah, that old chestnut.
Yeah. Not for everyone, right? Yeah, it could be really overwhelming as well. So that was their strategy. So they basically
choke, just for the record.
Definitely choke. Yeah. So they had just gone hard buying things, renovating it, and just putting themselves in that kind of scenario where I think it was going to be make or break. So anyway, they were making it, which was nice. And I asked them if there was any material I could, they could recommend, and they went over to the bookshelf and they pulled out Steve McKnight's like 0 to 130 properties that the book had just been released recently in 3.5 years or whatever. Basically, his story of how he went from being an accountant to buying all these little properties out in the west, I think it was, of Melbourne, and getting a few dollars a week positive cash flow from each one. So, and given that he's Steve McKnight's got an accounting background, there's lots of formulas in it, and it can be quite specific. So I digested that, and that was quite good. Not about development at all, but
no. But it got the fuse lit, mate, and that's kind of the point. And because all of us get inspired somewhere, and it's amazing the serendipity elements and the sliding doors that get you to a place where all of a sudden you go, hey, there's something here, and I don't know what that something is, but you were chasing what's going to get me financially free, and this was that flickering ember that said, well, maybe this is the one.
Yeah, well, that's it. I guess when you've got a context in mind, like a frame that you're looking for, and it was something like that. Like I don't know how I'm going to get to this scenario I have up here in my mind of being financially free, a better life, all this sort of stuff. But that was generally what I was moving towards, even if it was loosely at times. And in the back of this book, there was a little form you could fill out, and it was basically like an expression of interest for a course that he was running, or that he was going to run potentially in the future, or something like that. So, given that there was no risk in filling that out, I went, yeah, sure, that sounds interesting, and I filled it out and sent it in. And it was only, I think, a few months later, I got a phone call from some team member there saying, well, look, here's the course. This is what it would involve. You'd need to fly to Sydney here. You'd need to fly to Melbourne here. None of it was in Brisbane, and there'd be these day events or whatever. So, and it would cost this much. So I did sign up for that. I went and got a credit card for that. I didn't have a credit card. So it was costing me, I think it was like $100 a week back then, which is pretty substantial. It was a big chunk out of my pay. And I thought paying such a substantial amount for something would help me to be motivated. And that was only part of the story. It didn't really. So the weeks would just go by at times, and I would do nothing at all. And it would just be like burning money. But somehow I thought through osmosis, I was getting the learnings and the information that was going to help me.
Well, sometimes, and a lot of us, and I'm certainly guilty of this in the early days, when I see hundreds or thousands of people in our community have the same thing, where they think just turning up to something is going to be the magic pill to actually all of a sudden be this breakthrough. And, it doesn't always work. Attending something doesn't always get you the outcome that you're actually looking for. Now, I guess that the property flame had actually been ignited, but at the same time, you did a change in job in your IT career, and that's where you and I first met. So all the way back in 2006, from memory, we were doing almost mirror image roles in competing companies, and I can remember the number of times that we would turn up to a vendor's presentation or a vendor's networking event and that sort of thing, and you were like the opposition on the other side of the fence. So it's amazing how both of our careers, whilst ignited in very different ways, have followed very, very similar paths, mate. Number of similar mentors, a number of similar kinds of projects, similar sort of timelines, similar backgrounds. So yeah, that and with a mirror image, mate. That's although you look a little bit better with roughage than I do. So yes,
thank you, mate. Well, there's no opportunity for up here for me. It's gone. So
no, that's all
it's all down here and on the face and all that. Yeah.
All good. So I guess you went into that mentoring program and went into your very first project, and wasn't property development at the time, mate. What was your first project, and what went right, what went wrong? How did that play out for you?
Yeah, so I don't have great dates in mind on everything, but we've timelined out a few things. And anyway, this one I do know quite well, because I joined in the start of 2007 as we were having a really significant boom, and I just watched prices go up and up and up throughout the year. And being that I was very inexperienced and so on, I got caught up in the FOMO, like I've got to act now, fear of missing out. It's all going to eclipse my price point. And yeah, myself, my brother, and my girlfriend, we squirreled together our pot of money, which wasn't much at all. And I think we came up with we struggled to get the like 20 or 21,000 together or something like that was required to buy a house that would be our renovation project. There's lots of people in this course doing renovations, and it seemed like a good way to get into things. It's obviously lower capital, and you can do a lot of it yourself and all this sort of thing. So we got our borrowing capacity together as well, and we hunted. We ended up buying a house towards the end of the year, and the market had run up substantially by then. So I think we settled late November, maybe, it was leading into Christmas. We moved in for Christmas and we started doing some works. But it was literally, you know, a couple of weeks later that I started hearing rumors of this GFC thing. And that actually turned out to be quite a significant issue.
It wasn't quite just a thing, mate. It was a little bit bigger than that.
Yeah, it was a bit of an event. Yes, definitely something we all remember. So that extracted any potential profit out of that project. So that ended up being our home for quite some time. Like, I think it was 8 years we lived in there.
Wow.
So that was our first project, right? That was meant to be renovate and sell for, say, 40, 50 grand profit.
And ended up, I guess, is a noose around their neck, an anchor? What would, like, how did you, I guess, relate to that experience? What meaning did you actually give that?
That's a great question. I knew I jumped into something that I didn't really understand. I didn't have a good plan. I just thought I would renovate it and sell it and make money, but I couldn't like specifically explain how that was all going to happen. I hadn't done so much as a basic feasibility. So it was quite flying by the seat of my pants, as is probably the standard for buying property around the country. It just didn't work out. Longer term, like, it sort of trickled along and ended up selling for more than we bought it for. But obviously there's dollar erosion there, there's interest to consider, there's all the money sunk into it and all that sort of thing. But yeah, I did have that. I labeled that as a failure for quite a time. But I was, you know, it was tough, but I was still very keen on property, and I didn't find anything better. Not that I was specifically looking, but I was still keen on property, right? So in terms of, that was still the path I wanted to follow. I hadn't given up on that. I just didn't know exactly how or when I would be going forward to the next thing. And yeah, it turned out it was a few years later, I was introduced to a block of land out in Whoop Whoop, and I built a house, and that was the next project anyway.
And so, well, let's get into that one. So that was a gentleman, again, this is where some of our lives were quite parallel. So you did a project with a gentleman by the name of Jason Marinoff, who I guess regrettably has passed. Really great man. Jason was somebody who, in my world, I guess when I was starting the network, Jason was about presenter 4 or presenter number 5 as industry expert. So, you know,
right.
So you've picked up a project from him. What was that project, and you know, what worked or what didn't work in that?
Yeah, so Jason had a special way about him, as you know. Yes, very unique guy, right? In terms of, he could relate to a lot of people. He was very friendly and caring, and yeah, bit of a kind soul, right? So, and Jason was into projects, and he didn't do so much. Well, he did some development, I suppose, but he had a lot of buy and holds around the place and everything. He had picked up this quite decent chunk of dirt. I don't know how big it was exactly, but it would have been acres. All the way out south of Toowoomba. So Toowoomba, for anyone who's not from Brisbane, is sort of 2 hours west. So you're going away from the water, so that's an issue in the first place. And then you go another 30 minutes south, and there's not much going on in Clifton.
Not a lot at all.
And that's where the land was. Jason had cut up, maybe, I can't remember, it was like 5 blocks at the time, or 8 or 9 blocks, but that was only a small segment of what this parcel would or could be in the future. So he was saying, look, this land, I've got it priced at this level. If you were to purchase one of these, you could build a house on it, you could make some money and this kind of thing. So I used my rudimentary analysis to go have a bit of a look around the neighborhood.
Your wealth of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Very, very, definitely had a lot of, didn't know what I didn't know at the time. So I went out there and I went, yep, look, this sale over here looks good. This house had sold for like 360,000. It was a nice, clean little low set, similar land, all this sort of thing. And I thought, well, if I build something like that, based on his land price plus the construction price, I should be able to make, after interest and everything, I should be able to make like $60,000. And I thought, well, that's pretty great.
Which relative at the time was a lot of money. So, right now that doesn't sound like a lot, but relative, that was quite a bit.
Yeah, well, that was probably, that was the best part of, an annual income for me at the time. Yep. So that was probably where that number came from. Want to replace my annual income, that would be a sum of money. Obviously, that would be an amount that you work for effectively the whole year. So, yeah, pretty substantial at the time. So I did build this house. Found a builder, worked with the builder, had a design done. Pretty fortunate, the builder got it all done quite well. I engaged someone to help me with the colours and the selections to make sure that I picked suitable colours, or she picked suitable colours, which was great. A couple of the issues were it was so physically far away from Brisbane. Like, it was virtually a whole day round trip just to go out there. So that's not something I really considered. Obviously, it's clear if you think about it for just a minute that it's a long way away, and that's a drama. So that was part of the issue. A neighbour just a couple of doors down was an ex-builder, really friendly guy. Happened to bump into him at some stage, and he said, "Hey, give me your phone number, and you can call me, and I'll tell you what's going on at times." So anyway, I ended up with a bit of some eyes on the ground there, like a pseudo project manager type, and he'd give me updates from time to time. The concrete would get poured, and he'd say, "Wow, look, they've done this today," and take some basic photos on his probably 2-megapixel pocket camera at the time, and email those over to me.
Yep.
Yeah, so that was all part of it. And I would go out there and make visits and this sort of thing. But when it came time to sell the thing, it didn't shift. I ended up going through a few agents. There was no one in the market in Clifton. Like, it wasn't.
Well, I think it's a town of about 500 people, mate.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I didn't know then, and I still can't tell you. So yeah, there's just so many errors here. It's quite comical, really. So I did end up selling it. I sold it for a loss of about $60,000 in the end.
Mate, that's a good transition.
There you go. 120 delta from you expect to make 60 profit, you make 60 loss instead.
So what was the lesson you got out of that? So 2 in, 2 down. What's the lesson you got out of that one?
Proximity to project became a big thing from there. I was now very firm on being within a certain distance from my projects so that I could get to them quite easily. It didn't require such an effort to go and see it. Some people might not think that's an issue. I did. I just wanted to be closer. There was that. There was make sure that you're working in a market where there's actually demand. So from there, I decided to stay closer to Brisbane City, loosely within 12 to 15 kilometre radius was the target from there, and that's roughly where I've stayed since then. There's just an ongoing level of demand here that helps to bolster sales, and it helps if you make a little mistake on the product you're creating and so on. There's just more people around to potentially take it up. There's just people that want to be in the area, so yeah, you don't need to get everything perfectly right all the time. They were probably two of the biggest lessons there.
Mate, at this point with 2 down, and both didn't go to plan, a lot of people would just be given up. So what was the thing that kept you? I'm going to conquer this. What was the thing that said I'm going to do that?
I still didn't have a better method for getting to where I wanted to go. I didn't have another idea. I definitely didn't consider, say, going back to university. And I did go to university in there for only a couple of years after realizing I didn't want to do that career. But I didn't say go back and say, let's study law and become a lawyer and try to do it that path or anything like that. I had seen, I'd seen through the course and the books and things like this that there were people doing really well out of property. And I thought, if I build up my knowledge enough, spend enough time, hammer away at that craft, so to speak, that the results would be mine over time. Like it would happen eventually. And I always sort of thought it was just around the corner, which became very tiring at points as it's taken a lot longer.
Yeah, absolutely. So it takes 10 plus years to become an overnight success is what they reckon. And so you're a little bit into the journey at this point, but I guess struggling with elements of it. So at this point, both of those projects have been done with little to no education. So was one of the lessons here, hey, maybe I should get a little bit more, I guess meat on the bones sort of thing. And, was that kind of the start of you going down and looking at educators and that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, through the Steve McKnight course that I joined, a splinter kind of had come off and was meeting in Brisbane. So I would go along to those meetings, and I would meet different people through there. Actually, that's where I met Jason Marinoff from. So that had already been happening at the time. And I'd been exposed to more people through there, different methodologies and different concepts, people doing developments and renovations and buying and selling and whatever else, just meeting all sorts of different people. And what I saw was there were people from all sorts of different backgrounds. Like it didn't really matter what you had been doing before. There were transferable skills from different people's backgrounds, but you didn't have to have had a university degree or followed anything particular. It was more just about who you were, how determined you were, your resources that you could muster around you, and like a solid choice, I suppose, to be there and be doing that. That's one of the things that I see is and I know you would too. I see that as one of the standout items with people is they often haven't committed, haven't chosen, and I can appreciate that it can be hard to commit to something that you don't know where it's going to end up and what it's going to look like. But that's one of the biggest drums I find in general.
Yeah, well, I guess you've got an interesting play on words between the difference between decision and decide. Okay, so for people who study etymology, and which is the history of words, I guess it comes from Latin "decere," but decision is in incision is to cut, and side as in suicide, pesticide is to kill. A lot of people make the decision, so they make the cut. Yes, it's what I want to do, but they don't decide, and they don't actually kill any other opportunity for anything other than the thing that they want. I see lots of people making decisions. I don't see very many people deciding.
Yeah, true. That's a really good point, right? And I think it's human nature to want to leave options open and try to follow a few paths at one time to see which is going to work out best. But I find split focus to be quite a concern for myself. So these days I'm quite specific on what I'm doing, and if stuff starts to come into my sphere, into my world, and it's taking me away from my core focus, it's gone. I cut it off. I only have room for so much stuff. If I want to add something else in, I need to consciously make room in a sustainable way. Otherwise, everything suffers.
Yeah, absolutely. And you and I again crossed paths at some of those networking events that you're talking about. Hanging around with people that are doing things, becoming part of a tribe of things, I guess, that are moving in the right direction. But as you said, everyone was doing something slightly different. So at that point, you've decided that property development was what you wanted to do, and you started going down a path of, I guess, another education program and another mentoring environment. Again, similarly, you and I did the same mentoring guys along the way. What was your experience with that first education program? What was the, without going and naming anyone, but what was your experience in that process?
Yeah, what was different about that? So in the previous couple of things I'd done, it was a little bit easier to kind of be in the audience, and you were one of many participants in this program at the time. The way it was structured, I think there were probably only about 10 people in the room, and it wasn't a passive it wasn't all the time passively sitting there and listening. It was something where you needed to explain, what you were up to, where you're up to, if you had achieved these things. So there was some accountability, which was nice. It was a little bit more of a classroom situation. It wasn't always comfortable, which I think is a good thing now. I didn't realize at the time that you need to step outside. You hear it all the time. It's a cliche. It's a cliche for a reason, like step outside your comfort zone. But that's what that course had us do, like about it too, right?
Yeah,
and one of those things was, what could be considered a relatively simple concept of going and asking strangers for money, and and that was meant to be related to asking investors. So obviously, when I'm seeking, sorry, yeah.
I was going to say, just for everyone else, like they made us go out at lunchtime and ask a complete stranger for $5. Now,
Yeah.
it doesn't sound like a lot, but man, that was hard. That was confrontational. That was like, why would somebody give me $5? I don't know who they are.
Yeah.
Like it was very much trying to shift mindset. So as you said, it like if you don't get out of your comfort zone, you don't shift. So from that purpose, I got plenty out of it from a mindset perspective. Yeah, but less so from a skills perspective. But that's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, sure. No, that makes sense. Absolutely. I'll stop playing with my settings off to the side. Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, if you take a second now for anyone who's listening and you just think, and this might not be a big deal for you, but if someone now said to you, okay, well, you go out over the next half hour and you need to come back with as much money as you can, but let's say the target's, we'll adjust it for inflation. Let's say it's $50 today, right? So, you're going around to people and asking people to give you money. It's relatively confronting. It is definitely something to get you out of your comfort zone. And yeah, so anyway, that was meant to assist with approaching investors and so on. Today, I find it very easy to approach investors, and I feel like I'm offering a lot of value. It's not like walking up to someone on the street and asking them for $5. If I needed $5 to make a phone call, or if you could even do that anymore, which you can't, but if you needed it to buy some food or something because I was genuinely in a situation like I just lost my wallet or something, that would be different. I wouldn't have a concern doing that. But this was just a personal growth exercise, wasn't it?
Yeah, correct. And mate, lots of I guess emphasis on raising capital in that, and I guess to try and get investors and that sort of thing, especially early days when you don't have money. So really good lessons that have actually come out of it. But I guess you said there was only 10 odd people in the room. That I guess the coaching side of things. What experiences did you get out of that?
Yeah, so small knit group, people from all sorts of different backgrounds there. I remember in my group there was a financial planner. It was very interesting to see sort of the wealth of knowledge that he had in his professional life, but everyone's different person, right? So he would have challenges in certain areas where other people wouldn't. So it's very interesting to see how different people approach different scenarios and hear what would sort of be their barriers, what would come up, or a reason why you would or you wouldn't do something. So there was another part of that course that you'd remember where we were making offers. And the offer didn't need to be well crafted or anything. It just needed to be an offer. And it was also very confronting. And I remember people being, just flat out refusing and saying, no way, I'm not doing that. And this is their personal mindset, their belief system coming into play here, and they're saying, no, I won't do that.
Yeah, well, that was, and in context for everyone else, that was go make an offer on a property that you just read an ad in the paper with no due diligence, with no, so just go make an offer, right? You go,
yeah, you're skipping a few steps, right?
You're skipping a lot of steps. So that no wonder people are pushing back. But, again, it was intended to be that confrontational, to shift you to, because even if the offer is accepted, you can still say no, right? And that's the bit that that's the bit that I don't think people realize, that there is still a safety net. Even when you're stepping out of your comfort zone, there is still the safety net to say, look, you don't have to pull the trigger, you don't have to sign the contract, but unless you actually do something different, you're not actually going to move.
Yeah. It was like a series of events that are akin to jumping off a cliff into the water, into the pond below or whatever, at a waterfall or something like that. Like running up to the edge and jumping off is quite an event, right? And usually it's pretty scary. And if you keep doing it, it's fun, and hopefully you don't hit any rocks. But it's like that. It's ripping the Band-Aid off, trying something new. But it would also be very easy to sit down the bottom of the waterfall and watch people jumping off and let the fear take hold, and then never do that.
Yeah.
Or build it up so much that it's now so hard to go and do that.
Yeah. So I guess at this point, you got some education that's sitting behind you, but haven't yet pulled the trigger. You then go off on, I guess, a series of other personal development type courses and that sort of thing, not purely in the, I guess, the development space. I think you did a wealth mindset type one and that sort of thing. So, tell us a little bit about that and how that worked.
Yeah, absolutely. So through the Steve McKnight course, there were some other people that he was associated with, or business coaches and things like that he liked as well. And anyway, they would kind of all share databases. So there weren't a lot. There were just a couple, really, to be honest. But there was an opportunity to go and see Brennan Nichols at the time. He's a business and mindset coach. I work with him now quite a bit. And back then when I joined, it was a little bit too early for me. So I was in the room.
You didn't have a business.
Didn't have a business. I definitely didn't even have a property business. So I'm in the room there with people talking about how to increase their sales and how they'll, if they can be asking for upsells, like, would you like fries with that effectively? They could sell more stock. They could maximize a client. They could add more value into each transaction. They could look to expand their database, also increase prices, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of that business aspect that sort of I would lock away for later, but at the time was maybe not really super relevant. But a big part of what he taught as well was wealth mindset. So he was trying to get people to understand the concept of doing the work once and making passive income, not necessarily through property, but through whatever. Could be anything. Could be shares and dividends, or business was his specialty. So it was more about not seeing the $1 million you're about to get from something as $1 million, but rather seeing it as the 8% return per annum for the rest of your life. Yeah. And trying to build that up over time so that you've now got enough that you have a choice. So that resonated with me very well. And Nichols is a fantastic marketer. So I, saw lots of pictures of nice beach setting with a lounger and someone sitting there and enjoying a margarita or something. So I think that subconsciously got in, that if I follow these sort of paths, then I can have this sort of lifestyle.
So the irony of him using his sales techniques to get you in the room to then teach you the sales techniques that got you in the room, right?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The irony's not lost on me. It was at the time.
Yeah. So I guess back onto your development path, you, I guess, did a couple more, development courses. I guess one of those gentlemen was a very, no frills. Was that? I'm trying to think of a politically correct way to say this, but very direct. Sorry, no
bullshit.
So giving you some really good insights into, hey, just go do this. So moving you away from the the fluff and the intention, and more getting to how do you get rubber on the road.
Yeah. So this guy named Martin Ailes, he's from Adelaide. I believe he still resides there, and he started off doing sort of 3 and 4 packs of low set villas that were very much like a low set townhouse or unit or whatever you want to call it on a strata body corporate scenario. So he would take in certain suburbs around Adelaide in the general lower socioeconomic areas and where it worked, he'd buy an old house on a big parcel of land and he'd put 3, 4 or 5 of these units and he would aim to keep one and rent it out. And he did this to great effect in the earlier 2000s. And this was back when, say, I remember him bringing his Westpac guy into the room. And I can't quite remember that guy's name, but it was an interesting name anyway. And he'd just say, Rudy or whatever his name was, Rudy, he'd call him up and say, Rudy, I need some more money. And he would do a project on like with 50 grand cash and the rest would be borrowed from Westpac. So completely different financial landscape to what we see today. And it's just so much more complex now, but that was back in the days of super high leverage. And those stories were from pre-GFC as well. So we're skating that line of, we might be in the timeline of post-GFC, but a lot of his work had been done before and he had enough behind him now to keep that momentum rolling.
But getting in post-GFC didn't necessarily work. Yeah,
correct. So yeah, this character just very direct in how he spoke, and he'd be like, well, why are you working at Woolworths doing this when you can just go do a deal and make more in a deal than you would in a year there? And it's like, okay, well, yes, true, well done. He's
well, he's not
easier
wrong.
said than done.
Yeah,
he's not wrong. Yeah, well, why not? So yeah, the why not, of course, comes back to mindset, right? Mindset, beliefs, your mental structure, what's driving you, whether you can overcome your fears, step outside your comfort zone. It's like, you know, if this is your comfort zone here, trying to get in the camera, there we go.
Yeah, no, you're in. You're good.
There you go. There's your comfort zone. And this is where you reside. You know, it's very hard to do something new and revolutionary from within that comfort zone. You might even argue it's not possible. So you tend to have to step outside the comfort zone, and that's where things are uncomfortable and you don't know exactly what you're doing and you can feel the fear. He was a good teacher of this methodology of, well, you know, maybe you need to go door knock and letter drop people for sites. Yeah, and that's what he would do. He'd spend his weekends doing that.
Well, a good quote from Einstein, and I won't get it exactly right, but you can't solve a problem. So you can't solve a new problem with current thinking. So you need to actually get out of that comfort zone to get the different thinking, to actually take on that new problem. And I think that's where most of us kind of let ourselves down, is trying to stay within, you know, our sphere of comfort. So yeah, but you know, on the other side, once you get through the broken glass, it's comfortable over there too.
Yeah.
Yes. So, mate, in the interest of time, I guess you did, a number of courses along the way, and lots of knowledge, but not a lot of action until I guess you kind of had an epiphany to go, something's got to change. So, give us some insights into where you were at and what was happening at that point.
Yeah, great. So, I suppose the more I did these courses and so on. By the way, can you hear the whippersnipper in the background, or is that isolated?
It's mostly isolated. We're good, mate.
Yeah. Mostly isolated. Oh, fantastic. Distracting on this side. Anyway, so the more I was doing courses and things like this, the more opportunity there was to do different courses and meet different people and read different books and this sort of thing. And I took the approach of, I would take on all of that knowledge and I would go to these things if they seemed relevant, of course, and I just, you know, sow in that respect in terms of sowing and reaping. I would spend the time, I would go to all of them, and it was to a point where, you know, basically every second weekend I was away in Sydney or Melbourne or something like this, or Adelaide or in Brisbane, doing a course, going to some boot camp, doing something like this, and it was all very beneficial. And then what I realized after a bit was, right, other than the action I'd taken on those first 2 deals that didn't turn out so well, there was no more action happening now, and I effectively wasn't moving forward. So I wasn't moving forward, and I started to watch these courses and go, all right, let's see if I get the silver bullet, you know, the piece of information I need, the magic, magic, whatever you want to call it, the magic pill out of this next one. And I'd go along and I'd invariably find that it wasn't there. Now, if you did everything that they were telling you to do, it might have turned out really fantastically. I basically was realizing that I wasn't getting any traction. I was going to a lot of courses, and effectively I was still within this comfort zone, and things weren't going to happen within there. So I actually decided I was going to take a step back from doing all these courses and so on, and see what, you know, that space therefore allowed me to do, right?
And that's not unusual, mate. I guess I was one that went through a similar experience. You know, I spent about 120 odd K on my education, and you know, didn't have a lot to show for it. I see hundreds of people in our community that are course junkies and do stuff. You know, knowledge is great, but knowledge without application is really the I guess, because when you apply, that's when you get the lesson, and that's when you get the education changes from education into wisdom, right? Because you get to learn the knowledge, you get to see how well does that thing actually work. So what was the light bulb moment that you suddenly went, I'm going to do something with this?
Yeah, so I decided to pause on the courses, which is that worked out fairly well. We skipped a little bit earlier there that I did. You mentioned I moved to another IT job, and I did, which is where I came across, which is where I started reading the book. Actually, it was just after I was introduced to the Steve McKnight book. So I'd been in that role now for, I think, a year or a couple of years or something like that. Maybe it was even a few years. And so I started looking around for some other employment opportunity, basically, where I might be able to get into the industry and learn and still get paid. And I didn't expect to be paid as much as I was in IT, because I didn't have a lot of relevant skill, I didn't think. And I asked around a bit, happened to come across a lady running a buyer's agency who was just about to take maternity leave for her second child. Very small agency, and she would buy basic investment properties, units, houses, townhouses, things like that for her clients, as well as homes. So they could be expats returning from overseas, or locals, or interstaters, or whatever. So I heard of them. I got in contact with them. I got an interview. I got the role. Obviously, that's a bit of a that's compressing the time frame a little bit. So I effectively stepped into the boss's role with a little bit of training, and that's where I learned the very valuable aspect of contracts and contracts administration, at least in Queensland. So I effectively had to work with our lawyers, the client's lawyers, to be working out contracts, contract offers, where we could exit, what it would mean to add and remove clauses and adjust things. You know, put the risk of the contract back over to the seller rather than it sitting on the buyer. And I'd be running around hunting for property and making offers and all sorts of things on someone else's brief. So this was a fantastic way to get through that fear as well of making offers. Because it wasn't my purchase.
It was not your money. Yeah. It's easy.
That's right. Yeah. And they wanted a 4-bed house in a suburb, and they wanted it to look like this. And I would go looking for that. And if I couldn't find exactly what it was, I would show them the nearest thing, or we would work with their budget. You know, everybody wants something above their budget, or they want more house than they've got the budget for. So we would have those conversations as well. So very valuable role. And I did that for a year, actually, while I was finishing up that build with in Clifton. And then, I decided it was time to move on from there. I found you had to do a lot of purchases to make any commission. And it was hard. It was hard work. And I was actually really keen on doing projects and development. So I ended up resigning from there.
But at the time you resigned, you didn't really have a plan. You didn't have anything to step into. You just decided you want to do property development. Like, that takes kahunas of steel, mate. So, like, in all seriousness, like, you'd built up a tiny little nest egg that I think you said was about a year's worth of burn rate before you actually ran out of cash, and you just backed yourself. Like, I'm gonna suggest to everyone else out there, your risk profile might not be appropriate for that. A safer way for doing that might be, do your property developments in parallel to your day job, build a nest egg that builds a bigger buffer. But mate, you had a tiny buffer and enough to just get you through the 1 year, and mate, all the chips were in.
Yeah, pretty much. Yep. And it was, again, it was that sort of decision that led me to that. The decision that I'm going to make this work. I'm going to go forward with it. These are the steps I need to take that had me do that. And it was probably some impatience as well. And in addition to that little nest egg I built up, I also took a personal loan and had it set up like a line of credit. So I had a few dollars that I could tap there, but it formed part of the year of runway, basically. And I figured if I don't have something work out by then, I could go and get a job if I needed to. Like, I knew at the end of the day, I'm not going to be homeless on the street. We'll figure something out.
And whenever people are taking risk, mate, having that fallback plan and being comfortable with that fallback plan, I think a lot of people don't recognize, well, okay, if it doesn't work, get a job, right? It's the belief, firstly, that you can do it. That takes a lot. I think that would be a difficult mountain for a lot of people to actually climb. And then the knowledge and comfort that, well, if it doesn't work, at least I'm not going to die wondering. And I know that there is some safety net that actually sits there. I think a lot of us fear that the worst case scenario is the end. And they don't realize that the worst case scenario was just going back to what you're doing before.
That's right. And that might be painful and uncomfortable, but it also doesn't have to be permanent. And it could lead to a different scenario elsewhere that could work out well too.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it definitely took something, and it was definitely hard. It was hard for years, hard to top up that buffer and then just live on it, effectively not having anything left of the spoils that I'd worked for. So that sort of cycle of earn and spend went on for years. As I was learning to do developments there.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I guess, going all in. You had a couple of failed projects to date. You, I guess, have been burnt a little bit. You got a whole bunch of education behind you. But in order to have that level of comfort and have someone kind of looking over your shoulder, you went into business and got a business partner to start the journey. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So there was someone I'd met through one of the many communities, again, going to these meetings and so on. You get to mix with all sorts of people. There was someone I'd met a couple of years older than me, had been on a similar sort of path for a year or two longer. And he was also interested in doing development projects as well. So that afternoon that I actually resigned with no specific plan of where to go next, we caught up. So he gave me a call and said, do you want to get a coffee? So caught up, told him what I'd just done, told him my plan and this sort of thing. And one thing led to another, and that was kind of the conversation around us working together. So from my perspective, I thought that was quite a good move at the time, because I saw that he had done a couple more things than me, and even if he didn't know all the answers, I could leverage off that. And I sort of felt, I felt some sort of sense of security, like there was someone there that I could help to bounce off, or I could ask some questions of. And I didn't know at the time, but it was kind of like the piano teacher reading the piano book before you, just before your lesson, and they teach you how to play that section, and then overnight they go back and they read the book again and they learn a bit, and they come and teach it to you. Like the guy wasn't very far ahead is all I'm saying there, but it worked enough for us to do a bunch of deals, projects.
I think 12 projects from memory, but the business model wasn't quite right. So, you know, ignoring I guess the comments that you made on the experience side of things, the business model wasn't quite right,
Yep.
and you weren't getting the cash that you were looking for. What wasn't working with the business model?
So, of course, when you're working with different people's resources, everyone needs to get a share or some sort of point, some sort of amount that's percentage or something that's relevant, and has their involvement feel valued. But what had sort of been decided and set up is that we would do a 70-30 split. So it was 70% to the partner / investor that was putting in the capital and the capital and the borrowing capacity. And then we would get 30% as a group, as the two of us, and we would share that out. So as you can just imagine, with the way that project timelines tend to work and what a 30% share of something else could be, it became tough to manage when cash flow was coming in and this sort of thing. So it was effectively that concept that led to the point where I was like, I need to change the model. So I'm not going to stay with this. And he went off in a different direction too and did something a bit different. But it wasn't before we got into and completed a whole bunch of projects and sort of learned that this is a very hard way to earn a living, but you're kind of earning your stripes at the same time.
Yeah, so you build a whole bunch of experience from the actual running of the projects. You build experience in, I guess, gaining investors to actually go into things. So there's lots of positives that actually came out of it. But there's also, I guess, a couple of negatives from a lessons perspective on, you know, people management and those sorts of things. Kind of without throwing anyone under a bus. What are some of the things that you learned from that process?
Yeah, so I mean, it was just, you know, you do your best when you don't know. So you're relying on what you do know, I suppose. So our criteria for taking on partners was basically if they were interested and they had the funds and we thought it was a reasonable fit. These days I'm much more cautious with how I assess people, just to find out a little bit about how they might handle stress and speed bumps in the road and all sorts of things that pop up when you're doing this sort of role. But we would just take on partners, and then, as you know, it can be a long time to be in a relationship with people, for better or for worse. Like it's like a pseudo marriage at times. So we just effectively jumped into a bunch of relationships with people, and that's a fast way to learn. A really fast way to learn.
And, you know, marriages, you go in and you love the other person, and 50% of those don't work. So imagine when there's no love and it's just pure money, and, you know, sometimes there can be some friction in that process. So your client selection is super important.
That's right. Yeah. So that was something that was kind of lacking. Again, we did our best, but I have a far better process today.
Yeah. Well, which is a segue into, you went out on your own and you started RSD projects, and I guess started your own independent journey at that point. So what was different in that model, I guess, and this is kind of who you are still today. You know, you've gotten to 30 plus projects. At that point, you were 12. So most of this is within this RSD model. I'm sure that in that timeline, you know, you would have had a lot of successful projects, but every now and then, like you touch on, not everything goes to plan. Like,
no,
anything there that I guess are lessons for people out there to go, well, what is it that, you know, when you're planning for the best, you have to also prepare for the worst?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, I guess there's been a number of things along the way. Feasibility analysis is very important, I find, and taking your learnings from others around the place in the community, and also what you've worked on previously in the past to try and bring those lessons forward. Something that I changed immediately was this 70-30 split. So I didn't do that anymore at all. That tended to lead, just in my experience, and it would definitely depend on the people you're working with, but sometimes it led to a bit of wrestling over the steering wheel as to who was driving, so to speak, which is a conversation to have had up front, but we didn't necessarily do that. It was an assumed thing. Again, a reason why joint venture agreements, proper joint venture agreements, are a great idea. But effectively, what I've moved towards now is a situation where we do the borrowing in-house for the loans on the properties. Therefore, we have the directorship and the guidance and control, which allows us to make decisions faster. We don't have to go and sit down and have big long meetings or protracted exchanges regarding how we're going to proceed with something. We can ask for advice from people, we can ask for people's opinions and all sorts of things, but we effectively have the say. So that keeps some of our management overhead down, which is good, and we've got some great people around us in the team that can help that. So we do that, and I leverage in capital when there's a shortfall, and we work with investors on every project.
Yeah, so as equity partners per se.
Yeah, for interest rate return.
Yeah, so which means that you get to control your feasibility. You know exactly what those costs are going to be going in, and a whole bunch of, I guess, as you said, the control question. And I can certainly speak to my own experiences going into joint ventures in the early days. I had similar experiences, mate. So, there were times when you talk about two hands on the wheel. One hand was mine and one hand was theirs, and who's got the bigger bicep? That's not a pleasant place to be. So I've learned very similar lessons, mate. So mate,
a lot of energy.
Yeah. So I guess now you're approaching 30 odd deals, and I think we've touched on $70-ish million worth of projects over the timeline. A lot of those in the early days were smaller projects. What guidance and advice would you give to people from a scalability perspective? Doing the projects that you're doing now. So some of the stuff that you're doing now is much bigger in size. Any lessons in how and when to scale?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's funny. I was just thinking about the IT background and everything. I was just reminded of one of the directors in the company one time saying about a small sale she had done when she usually did much larger stuff for government and so on. She said, it takes as much work to do this small project as it does one of my bigger ones. And that's something that we talk about, right? And we hear. And while the bigger project in development might not be really the same work as a small one, it's a good portion the same, right? And you're getting
incremental.
Yeah, right. Depending on how many sort of new layers of skill are on top for that project. But if you're doing 2 lots, it's not a lot different to do 5 or 6, but you could have triple the outcome there. So I spent too long, I think, doing the smaller projects. I built rails to run on that fed me smaller projects, and they were the opportunities I was looking at. That's where everyone was talking about that, and I spent sort of too long. I've done so many pairs of houses and subdivisions, splitter blocks and things like that. Like, it's not funny. All those construction jobs, like, over and over and over again, that same sort of thing. So these days we do like quite boutique sort of houses and townhouses and larger lot land subdivisions, and a little bit larger, that is. But I don't see that as the end of the scale either. I'll probably step up again soon. I need to spend some time over Christmas and New Year when it's quiet and work out how do I want things to look. But my advice would be, and you work with people on this anyway, but would be to work out what's the outcome you want in the certain time frame. Like, if it's a certain amount of, usually it's a certain amount of money per annum people are looking for. So if you work out what that money is, and then you broke that back into a set number of projects, you should have a bit of a roadmap. And overlaying that, you'll also end up with a concept of how many you can run at a time, because they do all take a certain amount of time, right? And you've got to, this is mirrored, right? This is confusing me. You get the concept. They overlap over time, and you can't just necessarily go do 8 at once.
No.
Although I have before, and it's quite a lot of work.
Yeah. So I guess we in our property development formula program, we have this concept of a 5-year property action plan, which is doing exactly what you said. You get your end goal and start with the end in mind, and you work backwards to say, well, how do I do a smaller version of that? How do I do a smaller version? How do I do a smaller version till it's a bite-sized chunk that is actually within the skill sets that you can actually take on in the early days. And then each step you stretch, but you just stretch a little bit, and it's got to be within reach. Because if you're stretching an elastic band too hard, I guess it'll actually eventually snap. So you don't want to go too hard. But if you go the right amount, you stretch it, and then when you let it go, it never goes back to the same size. It's actually bigger than it was before. And then you can stretch it a second time. And I think trying to get people understanding that, each time you want to stretch, but it needs to be within reach. That's super important.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good point. And that's a direct explanation of what it is to expand your mindset, right? People can probably refer to what it is they do right now as a career. And there's some highly qualified, very technical people out and about that I run into that do amazing things of all sorts of, like, mergers and acquisitions of companies, and lawyers doing all sorts of things. But it could be anything as well, again, because you don't have to have a background in any of this sort of stuff. But those people didn't do that at one stage. They were 16-year-olds at the fish and chip shop as well, or whatever, or, and then they had to learn it, and it wouldn't have been comfortable. And there would have been times in university or wherever they were where they need to give presentations in front of teachers and get grilled. Like, my wife's done architecture, and they would be hammered consistently on their creative vision and all sorts of things. And it was part of the process, right? None of that's comfortable. So this is really not that different. It's just stepping into another unknown with what you know at the time, I suppose, and taking your best steps. And there's just so much information around today now, though. So I feel like anyone who really can commit to moving forward down that path and really wants it can make it happen through one way or another. And I get that's a bit of a tough statement. It is hard, and it's different for everyone's circumstances. But the toughest thing people will come across will be their own fear and mindset.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we're doing this series of In the Beginning, mate, is to show people that, like, we do have to start small, because that's where we are, and we do have to stretch. You gave the concept before of, the inside your comfort zone. What tends to happen is, if we do step out of our comfort zone, we step over here, we move the comfort zone somewhere else, and then we just stay comfortable there, right? Yeah. Whereas what we really want to do is we want that thing to keep on moving up the charts. And I think a lot of us if we do have the courage to step out, sometimes we just step one step. It's about having the constant and persistent, never ending improvement process of saying, well, I'm just going to keep growing. I'm going to keep, becoming just that little bit better version of myself every single day.
That's right.
Yeah.
I have a friend that whenever we chat, and that's, weekly or something like that, he asks me what's going on, and he's like, well, what challenges do you have? And I tell him the challenges. And then he always says to me, well, if it was easy, everyone would do it.
Mate, so
he says that every time. Yeah.
That's a really, I guess, good segue into, mate, what's next for Rod?
Oh, what's next? Well, I've just hired another staff member to help take things off my plate. So I'm mad keen at the moment on systemizing and automating the business. I have a handful of people working with me at the moment, and my point there is to get to a point where I can go and do a month or two over somewhere else, and everything still runs well. And obviously, with the ability to video things today, and it's not as hard as it used to be. But I want to get things off my plate, so I'm back to more specifically acquisitions. working with the pipelines I've set up for acquisitions, working with investors and finance. So you could put finance and investors in the same category if you want. So it's really that kind of acquisition front end of things, and then overseeing the vision of the project, the development management role, because I have a couple of project managers and administration and things like this. Yeah, so cool. That's where I'm at now.
And from a deal flow perspective, mate, you've got this financial goals that you not only aimed for, but absolutely smashed. So what were the financial goals that you had set, and how far ahead of target are you?
Yeah, if you really want me to cover that, so probably that's all right.
Give us some concept, mate.
Yeah, we'll give it. Yeah, we'll. So probably just looking at the calendar, the date here in the corner, would have been probably August last year. I decided, on top of whatever was happening from fresh point from August, I wanted to book 2 mil of net profit to the company by the end of the financial year. So that was, whatever, 8-9 months away, something to that degree. And we had achieved almost 3 mil by that time frame. So, targeted 2, hit 3, which is great. I was thrilled. And we've sort of continued on that path now. And I've pretty much, I've done my target now for the coming financial year. So I guess I need to revise that and make sure that it's, hence why I'm working now on the systemization and automation.
You still stretch it.
yeah, still stretching. There's heaps of room to stretch. Like there's so much more that could be done. It's really just a question of whether that's part of the plan or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's always to not only have a plan, but to actually execute on the plan, which is, I guess, the lesson that we got from earlier in the show, mate. So, mate, it has been fantastic actually sharing your journey, and I thank you very much for the lessons that you are providing out to our community in all of that. To demonstrate, it doesn't matter where you start, folks. We all have the same limiting beliefs from a mindset perspective. We all have the same desires to actually go and actually get to where we want to be. And we all have to start with deal number 1. And even when deal number 1 doesn't work, you can still overcome that. It's about the meaning that you give that thing, not what that thing was. Okay. And so, mate, I thank you very much, both for sharing your story, for being a friend, for contributing back into our community in so many different ways. So thank you, mate. It's greatly appreciated.
Yeah, you're welcome, mate. Yeah, thank you. It's been fun. Good to chat.
Well, good. Well, if you guys want to hang around, we do lots of these Sunday sessions every Sunday, and I guess some of these special ones in the beginning. So watch out for Rod, I guess, presenting real deals in our community, doing deals all around the place. Mate, you're always looking for investors, so reach out if you're wanting Rod. Free plug there, mate. But until then, folks, I'm going to say bye for now. See ya.
See you later.
Got to find the right button. Bye.
Bye.